Hi, I want to talk to you today about moral realism. It's best understood, I think, as realism applied to morality or ethics. And so the question is really about moral discourse. Are there any mind-independent moral truths? The moral realist answers yes. Now, I could really just stop here, but I think that doesn't explain the lay of the land. So let's take a step back. First of all, ethics, or normative ethics, or morality, is the question of, well, what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, what we ought to do, and so on. I've summarized it as consisting primarily of three questions. What should I do? What kind of person should I be? And how do I decide? That's normative ethics. We're thinking about what kind of people we should be, what we should do, how we go about making those decisions. But what are we doing when we engage in that kind of reasoning, when we think about what's right and wrong, when we classify certain states of character as virtues or vices? That seems to be a different sort of inquiry. It's called metaethics, when we're thinking not what should I do, but how do I go about even thinking about what to do? And what does it mean to call an action right or wrong? Those kinds of questions are questions about morality, not questions within morality. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Moral realism is not a position within ethics. It's a position about ethics, about what we're doing when we engage in ethical discourse. So let's ask a few meta-ethical questions. First question is moral discourse capable of being true or false? Is it something that has a truth value? When we make a statement like murder is wrong or generosity is a virtue, are we saying something that could even be true or false? Or are we doing something else? Well, let's phrase that as a basic question. As philosophers tend to think of it, we can ask, is moral discourse truth apt? That is to say, is it the kind of thing that is even capable of being true or false? We could think, are moral statements declarative statements? Are they making claims about the world or about anything else? Claims that could be true or false? Or are they doing something else? Expressing an attitude, for example, or giving a command, or doing something that isn't something we can even classify as true or false? Well, there are two possible answers here. We can say yes, or we can say no. If we say yes, we're saying, well, this is in the ballpark then of something to be evaluated as true or false. That is a position known as cognitivism. If we say no, then we're basically saying this is outside that realm of ordinary evaluation. It doesn't get truth values. It's not to be thought about as true or false. It's doing something else. That's a position generally called non-cognitivism. And I'm going to talk about that separately. Let's assume that we've answered this question yes, that moral statements are something like declarative statements. They're making assertions, and so they can be evaluated as true or false. They're capable of being true or false. Well, are any of them true? It might be, yeah, they're capable of being evaluated as true or false. They're all false, right? So here we can say, well, are they ever in fact true? And again, we have two possibilities. We could answer yes or no. Now, if we say no, if we say they're the kinds of things that are trying to make assertions about the world, for example, but gosh, they're just totally wrong-headed. They're all false. We end up with a position known as error theory. Error theory basically says, yes, we're trying to attribute moral properties to things, for example, but there are no moral properties, so everything we say in morality is just false. Well, that's a view. That could be. Maybe this is just a massive mistake. And so there are no moral properties, no moral qualities, no moral relationships, no moral facts. We're talking as if there are. We're saying there are, but it's just wrong. When we say generosity is a virtue, we're wrong. And it's not because of some surprising fact about generosity, that it's harmful in some ways or something. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's just that we're claiming that anything is a virtue, or that anything could be a virtue. No, there just are no virtues. And so it's a bogus idea from the get-go, not in the sense that it's meaningless. It's just making a lot of claims that are false. We could have a slightly milder, kinder, gentler version of this view, where we say, well, look, yeah, they're false, but they're not even trying to be true in the way you mean. They're really fictional. And so we could have a view known as fictionalism. The idea here would be that when we engage in fiction, storytelling and so forth, yes, in a certain sense we're saying a bunch of false things, but we can talk about what's true in the fiction, what's true in the story. And so there's a kind of way of talking as if these things were true, but of course they're not really. Robert Southey tells his story of the three bears, you're probably familiar with from your childhood. Once upon a time, 3 bears lived together in a cottage in the woods. Well, did 3 bears really live in a cottage in the woods? The literal-minded person might say, I don't know of 3 bears living together in a cottage. Do bears live in cottages? And, go on, and the rest of the story, it gets worse. I mean, these bears have chairs, and they have beds, and they eat porridge. Really? Southey's not trying to describe some zoological facts. Instead, he's telling you a story. Maybe morality is like that. We're not trying to actually describe the world in any way. We're doing something else, something like storytelling. Suppose, however, we answer true. We say moral discourse is truth-apt. It could be true or false, and in fact, it's sometimes true. We can now ask, is it mind-independent? Is it, in some sense, true about the world, something independent of us? Or is it mind-dependent? So once again, we can ask, is this mind-independent? And answer yes or no. If we answer no, we're saying there are moral truths. Moral discourse is not only capable of being true, it's sometimes true, but its truths are dependent on the mind. They're mind-dependent. In something like the way the conceptualist says there are universals, but they're mind-dependent. They're something like concepts or ideas or mental constructions. So similarly here, we might say, yes, there are moral truths, but they are something like moral constructions, moral projections, or something of that sort. Or they depend in some other way on our states of mind. That view is usually known as subjectivism. And there might be a variety of different kinds of subjectivism depending upon exactly what mind dependence we have in mind. There might be many ways in which moral discourse could depend on the mind, and so similarly, there are many different versions of subjectivism. Are these things truths about desires, for example, or about pleasures and pains, or other states of mind? Are they truths about approvals and disapprovals? There are lots of things we could say under the heading of subjectivism, and there are many different versions of such a theory. But suppose we say yes. We say not only is moral discourse capable of being true, and sometimes in fact true, but also, sometimes at least, it's describing a mind-independent fact. That is to say, true mind independently in a way that does not depend on mind. We are moral realists. So moral realism is that part of the logical space here in metaethics. It's the view that moral discourse is truth-apt, capable of being true or false, that it is at least sometimes true, and in a mind-independent way. And so the moral realist says, yes, there are mind-independent moral truths. Now that might sound odd to you, mind-independent moral truths. I think most people throughout the history of philosophy probably have been moral realists. I think most people intuitively are. They think the fact that murder is wrong is true, and they think, moreover, it's true not just because they happen to not want people to commit murder or something like that that's mind-dependent, but that there really is a mind-independent fact to the matter. What kind of truth, though, would it be? Some people have criticized this view, saying, I don't understand what that could be. What would be a mind-independent moral property be like? How could it exist? And what kind of thing would be a moral fact? So some philosophers have objected that these things, if they existed, would be very strange sorts of constituents of the world. But we don't have to think of them as strange or sui generis, though we could. We could think there is a special kind of moral quality or moral property or moral fact. We could also, however, say, Really, this is just an utterly ordinary, descriptive, natural fact under a different guise. So, just as there are different varieties of non-cognitivism, different varieties of subjectivism, so there are different varieties of moral realism, depending upon what kind of mind-independent moral truth is involved here and what makes those things mind-independently true. There are many different possible responses to that, and so many varieties of moral realism. Well, let's summarize. The moral realist says that moral discourse is truth-apt. It is capable of being true or false. It is appropriately thought of in terms of truth values. It is moreover capable of being true. Sometimes we say true things. Things like generosity is a virtue or murder is wrong. Then we say those things are independent of the mind. It's not just dependent on our desires or facts about our psychology or something. It is something really true about, for example, generosity as a state of character, or about murder as a kind of action. And so the claim is there are mind-independent moral truths. Whatever their character might be, whatever might make them true, there are such truths, they are mind-independent. And so this is a claim about the status of ethics, about the status of morality. Whatever you think in particular is right or wrong, good or bad, virtuous or vicious, the claim here is that you're making a claim about the world, about something outside of you and your states of mind, and that some of those claims might be true.